The hammer was rising when Deputy Shane Kellerman burst through the courthouse doors, his star-shaped badge catching the afternoon light streaming through dusty windows. On the makeshift auction block, a young woman with auburn hair and defiant green eyes stood with her chin raised despite the shackles around her wrists. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowded room of Millbrook's finest citizens, all eager to bid on indentured servants to work their sprawling farms. What's the opening bid for this fine specimen? Look at those strong hands. She'll make excellent help in the fields or kitchen. Shane's blood boiled as he watched Ivy Thornfield, the daughter of the town's deceased blacksmith, being treated like livestock. 3 months ago, when old Henrik Thornfield died of consumption, his debts had fallen to his only child. The town council, led by the ruthless banker Cornelius Wickham, had seized everything: the forge, the house, even Ivy's freedom. $50, called out Magnus Brewster, the wealthiest cattle rancher in 3 counties, his yellowed teeth visible in a predatory grin. I could use a pretty thing like that to warm my 100. Shane's voice cut through the crowd like a blade. Every head turned toward the young deputy, whose reputation for fairness and integrity was matched only by his skill with a Colt .45. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he pushed through the stunned onlookers, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor. Ivy's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been hope. She'd noticed the handsome deputy before who hadn't. Shane Kellerman was 28, built like a man who'd spent years breaking horses and chasing outlaws across the prairie. But more than his broad shoulders and piercing blue eyes, it was his reputation for standing up to injustice that had caught her attention during the few times their paths had crossed at the general store. Deputy Kellerman. Cornelius Wickham's voice dripped with disdain as he adjusted his gold watch chain. I wasn't aware law enforcement participated in such commercial endeavors. Shane stepped closer to the auction block, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Every citizen has the right to participate in legal proceedings, Banker Wickham. Unless you're suggesting this auction isn't legitimate? The crowd murmured with tension. Everyone knew about the bad blood between Shane and Wickham, dating back to when the deputy had arrested the banker's son for cheating at cards in the saloon. The charges had mysteriously disappeared after substantial pressure from the town's wealthier families. But Shane hadn't forgotten. 125? Magnus countered, his face reddening with anger and alcohol. You got no business. Here, boy. Shane met Ivy's gaze across the room and saw something flicker in her emerald eyes, not just gratitude, but recognition of a kindred spirit. Both of them understood what it meant to fight against a system designed to crush anyone without wealth or family connections. $200, Shane announced, his voice steady as steel. The courthouse fell silent except for the ticking of the ancient clock on the wall. $200 represented nearly 6 months of a deputy's salary. Even Wickham looked surprised at the audacious bid. The silence stretched like a taut rope about to snap. Magnus Brewster's face had turned the color of fresh beef, his thick fingers gripping the brim of his hat as he calculated whether pursuing this bidding war was worth the cost. $200 could buy him 10 head of prime cattle, and his practical nature warred with his desire to possess the spirited young woman who'd caught his eye. Going once, the auctioneer called, his gavel hovering uncertainly in the air. The man, Herbert Grimsley, had conducted dozens of these auctions over the years, but never had he seen such tension crackling through the crowd. Shane kept his eyes locked on Ivy's, trying to communicate without words that he had a plan beyond simply purchasing her indenture. She seemed to understand, giving him an almost imperceptible nod that sent his heart racing faster than it had during his last shootout with cattle rustlers. 250. Magnus roared, slamming his meaty fist on the chair in front of him. I'll not be shown up by some badge-wearing puppy. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. That kind of money could buy a small farm, complete with livestock and equipment. Shane felt sweat beading on his forehead as he reached into his vest pocket, feeling the thin bundle of bills that represented his entire life savings money he'd been setting aside to buy his own piece of land and maybe, someday, convince some lucky woman to share it with him. 300, Shane said quietly, but his voice carried to every corner of the room. This time, even Cornelius Wickham's composure cracked slightly. He leaned forward, studying the deputy with calculating eyes. Something was happening here beyond a simple auction, and the banker's instincts told him it might be worth investigating. Magnus Brewster stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. For a moment, Shane thought the big man might challenge him to settle this outside with fists or pistols. Instead, Magnus spat into the brass spittoon beside him and stalked toward the door. "She ain't worth bankrupting myself over," he muttered, though his hungry gaze lingered on Ivy until the very last moment. "Going once, going twice, ... Grimsley's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Sold to Deputy Kellerman for $300. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment concluded, but Shane noticed several men whispering among themselves and shooting dark looks in his direction. He'd made enemies today, powerful ones who wouldn't forget this public humiliation. As the shackles were removed from Ivy's wrists, she rubbed the raw marks left by the iron bands. Shane approached slowly, acutely aware that despite his good intentions, he now legally owned this woman's labor and, to some extent, her life. "Miss Thornfield," he said softly, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that surprised her. "I want you to know that I didn't buy your indenture to own you. I bought it to free you." Ivy's eyes searched his face, looking for deception or hidden motives. She'd learned to be suspicious of men's promises after watching how quickly her father's so-called friends had turned their backs when debts came due. "And what do you want in return, deputy?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight tremor that she tried to hide. "In my experience, men don't spend small fortunes on women without expecting something back." Shane glanced around the nearly empty courthouse, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "What I want is to see justice done. Your father was a good man who got taken advantage of by predatory lending practices. What happened to you today was legal, but it wasn't right." "That doesn't answer my question," Ivy pressed, though something in his earnest blue eyes made her want to trust him despite every instinct screaming caution. Shane took a deep breath, knowing his next words would change both their lives forever. "What I want, Miss Thornfield, is the chance to court you properly, not as your owner, but as a man who's been admiring you from afar and hoping someday to earn your affection honestly." The confession hung between them like morning mist over the prairie, delicate and transformative. Ivy felt her breath catch as she studied Shane's weathered face, searching for any sign of deception. She'd grown up watching her father judge men's character by the steadiness of their gaze and the firmness of their handshake, and everything about the deputy suggested honesty, even if his methods were unconventional. "You spent $300 for the chance to court me?" she asked, a hint of incredulity creeping into her voice. "Deputy Kellerman, I appreciate what you've done, but that seems like an expensive gamble on a woman you barely know." Shane's cheeks reddened slightly, but he held her gaze. "I know enough. I know you spent every Sunday for 2 years nursing Mrs. Patterson when she was dying of the fever, even though she couldn't pay you a cent. I know you kept your father's forge running after he got sick, doing work most men would struggle with. And I know you stood up to Magnus Brewster when he tried to foreclose on the widow Morrison's farm, even though crossing him put you at risk." The fact that he'd noticed these things, had been paying attention to her life and choices, sent an unexpected warmth through Ivy's chest. In a town where women were often invisible unless they were causing scandal or getting married, Having someone see her actions and character felt almost revolutionary. Those were just what anyone would do, she murmured, suddenly self-conscious under his intense attention. No, they weren't. Most people in this town look the other way when injustice happens, as long as it doesn't affect them personally. Shane gestured toward the door where Cornelius Wickham was still lingering, probably eavesdropping on their conversation, which is why we need to be careful. What I did today was legal, but it won't sit well with certain powerful people. As if summoned by Shane's words, Wickham approached them with the measured steps of a predator who'd spotted wounded prey. His silver-headed walking stick tapped against the floorboards in a rhythm that seemed designed to intimidate. "Deputy Kellerman," the banker said smoothly, his cold gray eyes flicking between Shane and Ivy. "I must say, your purchase today was quite surprising. I wasn't aware that law enforcement salaries had become so generous." Shane straightened, his hand instinctively moving closer to his gun belt. "My personal finances are none of your concern, Wickham, as long as I'm paying my debts and conducting legal business." "Oh, but they are my concern," Wickham replied, his thin lips curving in what might generously be called a smile. "You see, I hold the note on that little cabin you've been renting from Jeremiah Walsh, and coincidentally, I've just learned that Mr. Walsh is in some financial difficulty himself. He might be forced to sell that property sooner than expected." The threat was delivered so casually that it took a moment for its full implications to sink in. Shane felt ice forming in his stomach as he realized how vulnerable his impulsive gesture had made him. Without a place to live, keeping his job as deputy would become nearly impossible, and without his job, he'd have no way to pay off Ivy's indenture or support them both. Ivy stepped forward, her green eyes flashing with anger. "You can't punish a man for participating in a legal auction that you yourself organized." "My dear girl," Wickham's tone was patronizingly gentle, "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm simply conducting business. The same way this auction was simply business." He turned back to Shane. "I trust you understand the precarious nature of your situation, Deputy. It would be unfortunate if your romantic gesture resulted in hardship for you both." Shane's jaw clenched as he fought the urge to wipe that smug expression off Wickham's face with his fist. But violence would only give the banker excuse to have him arrested and stripped of his badge, which would accomplish nothing except leaving Ivy completely defenseless. "I understand perfectly," Shane said through gritted teeth. "Is there something specific you want, or are you just here to make threats?" Wickham's smile widened, showing teeth that reminded Ivy uncomfortably of a snake's fangs. "I want you to remember that every action has consequences, Deputy. And sometimes those consequences extend far beyond the person who makes the choice." As Wickham's footsteps faded down the courthouse steps, Shane and Ivy stood in the gathering dusk, both acutely aware that their lives had just become infinitely more complicated. The banker's threat hung over them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, dark with the promise of trouble ahead. "He'll try to destroy you," Ivy said quietly, watching Shane's profile as he stared out the window at the main street of Millbrook. Gas lamps were beginning to flicker to life, casting long shadows between the buildings. "Because of what you did for me, he'll try to take everything you have." Shane turned to face her, and in the dim light filtering through the courthouse windows, his features looked carved from granite, determined and uncompromising. "Let him try. I've been looking for an excuse to take Wickham down a peg or two for years. Maybe this will finally give me the opportunity." "This isn't a game, Deputy," Ivy began, but Shane held up a hand to stop her. "Shane," he said, "if we're going to face whatever's coming together, you should call me Shane." The intimacy of using his given name sent a flutter through Ivy's stomach that she tried to ignore. She had more pressing concerns than the undeniable attraction she was beginning to feel toward this man who'd literally bought her freedom. Shane, then. But you need to understand what you've gotten yourself into. Wickham doesn't just hold your housing note. He owns half the businesses in town, sits on the town council, and has enough political connections to make your life miserable in ways you haven't even imagined yet. Shane smiled grimly. Then we'd better make sure we stay one step ahead of him. He picked up his hat from a nearby chair and settled it on his dark hair. First things first, we need to get you somewhere safe for the night. My cabin is small, but it has a separate room you can use. Tomorrow we'll figure out our next move. Ivy hesitated. Staying in an unmarried man's home, even with separate sleeping arrangements, would fuel enough gossip to last Millbrook's busybodies for months. But her alternatives were limited. She had no money, no relatives, and most of her father's friends had proven fair weather when creditors came calling. People will talk, she pointed out. People are already talking, Shane replied pragmatically. After what happened in here today, there's no avoiding that. At least this way, you'll be safe while they're running their mouths. As they walked through the quiet streets toward Shane's cabin on the edge of town, Ivy found herself stealing glances at the man who'd upended both their lives with a single impulsive bid. He moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to danger, his hand never straying far from his gun, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for threats. "Can I ask you something?" Ivy said as they passed the darkened windows of her father's old forge, now sealed with a chain and padlock. Courtesy of Wickham's collection agents. "Anything. Why me?" "I mean, I understand wanting to stop an injustice, but $300. She shook her head. "That's more money than most people in this town see in a year. There had to be easier ways to help if that's what you were really trying to do." Shane was quiet for so long that Ivy began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "Do you remember last Christmas when the Henley children got sick with scarlet fever?" Ivy nodded. The Henleys were a poor family who'd lost their farm to drought and lived in a ramshackle cabin near the river. When sickness struck, they'd had no money for a doctor and no relatives to help care for the children. "I saw you every day for 2 weeks, carrying soup and medicine to that cabin, sitting up nights with those kids when their fever broke. You never asked for thanks or payment. You just did what needed doing because it was right." "Anyone would have." "No," Shane interrupted firmly. "Anyone should have, but you did. And when little Tommy Henley died despite everything you tried to do, I watched you cry at his funeral like he was your own child." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "That's when I knew I was in love with you, Ivy Thornfield. Not because you're beautiful, though God knows you are, but because you have a heart that can't ignore suffering, even when helping others costs you more than you can afford." The words hit Ivy like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her stumble slightly on the uneven dirt road. Shane steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow, the warmth of his touch burning through the thin fabric of her dress sleeve. "You love me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze rustling through the cottonwood trees that lined the path to his cabin. Shane's hand dropped away, and he resumed walking, his long strides forcing her to hurry to keep up. "I shouldn't have said that. Not now, when you might feel obligated to return feelings you don't have because of what I did today." "Don't you dare," Ivy said, her voice sharp enough to make him stop and look back at her. "Don't you dare make decisions about what I feel or don't feel. I've had enough of men thinking they know what's best for me without bothering to ask my opinion." The fire in her green eyes made Shane's heart race, and he realized this was exactly why he'd fallen for her, this fierce independence, this refusal to be diminished or controlled, even when circumstances tried to force her into submission. "You're right," he said quietly. "I apologize. What I meant was that I don't want you to feel pressured to. To what? Fall in love with my rescuer?" Ivy stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap in her hair despite the day's ordeals. What if I told you that I noticed you long before today? That I used to time my trips to the general store for when you'd be picking up supplies, just to catch a glimpse of the deputy who actually seemed to care about justice instead of just keeping the peace. For whoever had the most money. Shane's breath caught. Ivy ... What if I told you that when Magnus Brewster cornered me behind the blacksmith shop last month and tried to force his attentions on me, I fought him off thinking about how you would have stood up for me if you'd been there? Rage flashed through Shane's eyes at the thought of Brewster putting his hands on her. He did what? Why didn't you report? To whom? Sheriff Dalton, who owes his job to the town council that Brewster sits on. Deputy Morrison, who's so scared of his own shadow he wouldn't arrest his grandmother for jaywalking. Ivy shook her head bitterly. I handled it myself, same as I've been handling everything else since Papa died. You shouldn't have had to handle it alone, Shane said fiercely, and you won't have to anymore. They'd reached his cabin, a modest but well-maintained structure with a covered porch and flower boxes that revealed an unexpected domestic side to the tough lawman. Shane lit a lantern hanging by the door, its warm glow pushing back the shadows of approaching night. Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished but clean, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and what appeared to be a single bedroom visible through an open doorway. Shane noticed Ivy's questioning glance and colored slightly. I'll sleep on the floor out here, he said quickly. You can have the bed. Absolutely not. You've already sacrificed enough for me today. Ivy looked around the cozy space, noting the bookshelf filled with volumes on law and philosophy, the chest set on a small table by the window, the carefully tended herb garden visible through the back door. Besides, this is your home. I'm the intruder here. You're not an intruder. You're... Shane paused, seeming to struggle with how to define their relationship. Legally, she was his indentured servant. Practically, she was a guest he was trying to protect. Personally, she was the woman he'd just confessed to loving. I'm a complication, Ivy finished for him, but not unkindly. A complication you've chosen to take on, but a complication nonetheless. Shane moved to light the oil lamp on his kitchen table, his movements careful and deliberate. You're not a complication, Ivy. You're the first thing I've done in years. That feels completely right, even if the method was unorthodox. The simple honesty in his voice made something warm and dangerous unfurl in Ivy's chest. She'd been on her own for so long, fighting every battle alone, that having someone willing to stand beside her felt almost too good to be true. Shane, she said softly, what happens tomorrow? When Wickham starts making good on his threats and the whole town realizes what we've done. Shane set down the lamp and looked at her directly, his blue eyes steady and sure. Tomorrow we start fighting back, but tonight, he gestured toward the small kitchen. Tonight we have supper, and we talk, and we try to figure out how two people who barely know each other are going to build something real out of this impossible situation. Ivy felt tears prick her eyes at his matter-of-fact acceptance of the challenges ahead. And if we can't? If this all falls apart and we both end up worse off than when we started? Shane crossed the small space between them and gently cupped her face in his calloused hands. Then at least we'll have tried to do something right in a world that doesn't seem to reward righteousness very often. Dawn crept through the cabin, windows like a reluctant witness, illuminating the aftermath of a night spent in conversation that had stretched until the small hours. Shane had kept his word about sleeping on the floor, though Ivy had noticed him checking the locks on the doors and windows several times, before finally settling down with a blanket near the fireplace. The sound of approaching hoofbeats brought them both instantly alert. Shane was on his feet with his gun drawn before Ivy had fully awakened, and she watched with growing dread as he peered through a gap in the curtains. 3 riders, he said grimly, including Sheriff Dalton. Ivy's stomach dropped. Dalton was Wickham's creature through and through, a man who'd sold whatever integrity he might once have possessed in exchange for a comfortable position and the banker's protection. If he was here at dawn, it meant Wickham had wasted no time in making his next move. Deputy Kellerman. Dalton's voice boomed across the yard. Come out here. We need to talk. Shane holstered his weapon and straightened his shoulders. Stay inside, he told Ivy quietly. Whatever happens, don't come out unless I call for you. Shane, no. We should face this together, not this time. His eyes were steel-hard with determination. If something happens to me, there's a loose floorboard under the bed. I've got some money hidden there, enough to get you to Denver or San Francisco. Start over somewhere Wickham's influence can't reach. The matter-of-fact way he spoke about his potential death made Ivy's chest tighten with fear and something deeper. The realization that somewhere in the span of one night, this man had become precious to her in a way that went far beyond gratitude. Don't you dare get yourself killed, Shane Kellerman, she whispered fiercely. Not when we're just getting started. He smiled at that, quick and genuine. Yes, ma'am, I'll do my best to avoid it. Shane stepped onto the porch, his badge catching the early morning light. Sheriff Dalton sat his horse in the center of the yard, flanked by 2 deputies Ivy didn't recognize, outsiders, probably brought in specifically because they had no loyalties to anyone in Millbrook except whoever was paying them. Sheriff, Shane said evenly, you're up early. What brings you to my property? Dalton, a heavy-set man whose gut strained against his vest buttons, leaned forward in his saddle. Got some disturbing reports about yesterday's auction, deputy. Seems there might have been some irregularities in the bidding. What kind of irregularities? Shane kept his voice neutral, but Ivy could see the tension in the set of his shoulders from where she watched through the window. Well, for one thing, there's questions about where a deputy sheriff came up with $300 in cash. That's a lot of money for someone on your salary. Dalton's tone was conversational, but his meaning was clear. Some folks are wondering if maybe you've been supplementing your income in ways that might not be entirely legal. Shane's jaw tightened. I hope you have some evidence to back up those accusations, Sheriff. Because suggesting that a peace officer is corrupt is a serious charge. Oh, I'm not suggesting anything, Dalton said with false geniality. I'm just saying that concerned citizens have brought their worries to my attention, and as sheriff, I have a duty to investigate any potential wrongdoing. One of the hired deputies shifted in his saddle, his hand resting pointedly on his gun butt. The message was clear. Shane was outnumbered and outgunned, regardless of whatever moral authority his position might theoretically provide. What do you want, Dalton? Shane asked bluntly. Well, first thing is, we're going to need to search these premises. Make sure there's no ill-gotten gains hidden away somewhere. Dalton's eyes flicked toward the cabin windows, and Ivy instinctively stepped back into the shadows. And then we're going to need to talk about the girl. What about her? See, there's been some questions raised about the propriety of a single man keeping a young woman in his home, especially one he technically owns. Some folks think it might be better for everyone if she was transferred to more suitable accommodations. Shane's hand moved closer to his gun. She's under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. Now, deputy, there's no need to get hostile. But Dalton's own men had straightened in their saddles, hands moving to weapons in response to Shane's threatening posture. We're just trying to do what's best for everyone involved. Mr. Wickham has generously offered to take responsibility for the girl's welfare. He's got a big house, plenty of room, and his wife can provide proper female supervision. The thought of Ivy under Cornelius Wickham's roof subject to whatever twisted plans the banker might have for revenge, made Shane's vision go red around the edges. He'd die before he let that happen. "Over my dead body," he said quietly, but in the morning stillness, his words carried clearly to every man in the yard. Dalton sighed theatrically. "Well, Deputy, I was hoping we could settle this peacefully, but if you're going to be unreasonable." He nodded to his hired guns, who began to dismount. Inside the cabin, Ivy watched the confrontation escalate and made a decision that would have horrified Shane if he'd known about it. Moving quietly to where he kept his rifle mounted on the wall, she checked the chamber and positioned herself at a window with a clear view of the yard. She might not be able to prevent what was about to happen, but she'd be damned if she'd let Shane face it alone. The standoff stretched like a wire about to snap, tension crackling through the morning air as the hired guns spread out to flank Shane's position on the porch. Dalton remained mounted, comfortable in his superiority of numbers, but there was something in the deputy's stance that made him hesitate. Shane Kellerman hadn't built his reputation by backing down from fights, even when the odds were against him. "Last chance, Deputy," Dalton called out. "Turn over the girl, submit to our search, and maybe we can work something out that keeps you wearing that badge." Shane's response was to draw his Colt .45 in one smooth motion, the barrel aimed directly at Dalton's chest. "And here's my final answer, Sheriff. Get off my property, or I start shooting." The morning exploded into chaos. The hired guns went for their weapons, but Shane was already moving, diving off the porch as bullets splintered the wood where he'd been standing. From inside the cabin, Ivy's rifle cracked, and one of the gunmen spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. Shane rolled behind his water trough, using it for cover as he returned fire. His first shot took the second hired gun in the leg, sending the man sprawling. Dalton, faced with the collapse of his easy intimidation, wheeled his horse around and spurred toward town, shouting about calling for backup. "Coward!" Shane shouted after the retreating sheriff, but his attention was already focused on the wounded gunman who was trying to crawl toward his fallen weapon. "Don't," Shane advised, his gun trained on the man. "You've lost enough blood for one morning." Ivy emerged from the cabin, still carrying the rifle, her face pale but determined. "Are you hurt?" Shane did a quick inventory of himself, finding only minor scrapes from his dive off the porch. "I'm fine, but this changes everything. Dalton, we'll be back with more men, and next time they won't bother with the pretense of legality." The wounded gunman groaned, pressing his hand against the spreading bloodstain on his shirt. "Lady's got good aim," he muttered with grudging respect. "Shoulders busted, but I'll live." "More's the pity," Shane replied coldly. "Who's paying you?" The man laughed bitterly. "Like you don't know. Wickham wants the girl, and he wants you. Gone. Permanent like. Today was supposed to be the easy way." Shane and Ivy exchanged glances. They both understood what that meant. If Wickham couldn't destroy Shane through legal channels, he'd resort to more direct methods. "We can't stay here," Ivy said quietly. "He'll send an army next time," Shane nodded grimly. "Pack whatever you can carry. We've got maybe an hour before Dalton comes back with half the county militia." As Ivy hurried inside to gather supplies, Shane bound the wounded gunman's injuries. He might be an enemy, but Shane wouldn't let a man bleed to death. The other gunman was unconscious but breathing, his leg wound serious but not fatal. "You could run?" the wounded man said as Shane tightened the bandage. "Take the girl and disappear into the territories. Wickham's got a long reach, but not that long." "That would be the smart play," Shane agreed. "But I didn't become a lawman to run from bullies, no matter how much money they have." "Then you're a dead man walking, Deputy. Wickham's got the law in his pocket, the politicians, half the businessmen in town. You got what, a pretty girl and a stubborn streak?" Shane smiled grimly. "Sometimes that's enough." Ivy reappeared with a traveling bag and Shane's saddlebags packed with supplies. She'd also strapped on her father's old gun belt, the weight of his pistol unfamiliar but reassuring. At her hip, "Where are we going?" she asked as Shane saddled his horse. "To see Judge Patterson in the county seat. He's one of the few men around here that Wickham can't buy or intimidate. If anyone can help us turn this situation around legally, it's him." They rode hard through the morning, following deer paths and creek beds to avoid the main roads where Dalton's posse might be waiting. Behind them, smoke began to rise from the direction of Shane's cabin. Apparently, Wickham had decided that if he couldn't have his revenge, he'd settle for destroying everything Shane had built. "I'm sorry," Ivy said as they paused to water their horse at a stream. "You've lost everything because of me." Shane turned to face her, his blue eyes intense. "I haven't lost everything. I've got the most important thing right here." He reached out to touch her cheek gently. "And for the first time in my life, I'm fighting for something that really matters." 3 weeks later, Judge Patterson's courtroom was packed as the county's most anticipated trial in years reached its conclusion. Through a combination of Shane's testimony, evidence of Wickham's illegal lending practices, and testimony from other victims of the banker's schemes, the tide had finally turned. Wickham sat at the defendant's table, his silver hair disheveled, and his expensive suit wrinkled, facing charges of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Dalton had already plea bargained his way to a lesser sentence in exchange for testimony against his former patron. In the matter of the indenture of Miss Ivy Thornfield, Judge Patterson announced, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "This court finds that the original debt was fraudulently inflated and the auction conducted under false pretenses. The indenture is hereby declared null and void." Ivy felt tears of relief streaming down her cheeks as Shane squeezed her hand. They'd won not just the legal battle, but something more important. 6 months later, Deputy Shane Kellerman married Ivy Thornfield in the same courthouse where their love story had begun. The reception was held in the rebuilt blacksmith shop, which Ivy had inherited back along with the rest of her father's property when Wickham's empire collapsed. As they danced under the stars, surrounded by friends who had finally found the courage to stand against injustice, Shane pulled his wife close and whispered in her ear, "No regrets about that expensive gamble?" Ivy smiled up at him, her green eyes sparkling with happiness. "Best $300 anyone ever spent," she said, and kissed him as the fiddles played and the whole town celebrated the triumph of love over greed, courage over corruption, and hope over despair. In the distance, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, full of promise for two hearts that had found their way to each other against impossible odds.